The morning had started with the faint, trembling excitement that every bride felt before a wedding, yet for her, it carried a heavy weight of anxiety. Cradling her newborn tightly in her arms, she arrived at the small, sunlit chapel on the edge of town, hoping to finally step into a future she had imagined with love and warmth. But the reality that greeted her was a cruel shock. The pews were empty, the flowers slightly wilted, and there was no trace of the man she had promised to marry. Her heart thudded violently in her chest as the bitter realization hit. He had abandoned her. Panic clawed at her chest. She glanced at the small clock above the chapel entrance, each tick echoing the sudden emptiness she felt. The ceremony she had dreamed of, the promises exchanged in front of family and friends, all dissolved in an instant. But it was not just the absence of her fiancé that cut deepest. It was the knowledge that she had no one to rely on. Her own family lived miles away, tied up in their own struggles, and the friends she had once trusted seemed distant, wrapped in their private lives. As the reality of abandonment settled over her, she could hear whispers creeping from the town outside the chapel doors. The local gossip traveled faster than the wind. The young bride, left alone with a newborn, was suddenly the subject of public scrutiny. Their eyes, curious and judgmental, pressed upon her like invisible hands, dragging her down further into humiliation. She felt their stares as she tried to soothe her infant, who had begun to fuss nervously in response to her own tension. Each cry from the baby seemed to mock her, a stark reminder that she could not even provide security for the most vulnerable life in her care. Yet, amid the fear and shame, a quiet determination began to stir within her. She could not undo the betrayal, nor could she make the world's judgment disappear, but she could protect her child and herself. Clutching her baby to her chest, she moved toward the chapel doors, carefully navigating the judgmental gazes. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if asserting a fragile ownership over her dignity. Every step was a silent declaration. She would not crumble under their scrutiny. Her mind raced through the events leading to this moment. Only yesterday, she had felt a spark of hope and excitement, dreaming of a life filled with love, laughter, and security. She had imagined herself walking down the aisle in a flowing dress, the sunlight catching her hair, and hearing the whispered promises of a man who had assured her of loyalty. Now, all those dreams seemed to vanish into the cold air, replaced by a harsh reality she had never anticipated. She felt tears sting her eyes, but refused to let them fall. There was no private space to grieve. The world was watching, judging, and she had to remain composed. In the quiet of that moment, a strange mixture of fear and resolve settled over her. She understood, painfully, that she was utterly alone in the world. And yet, beneath that realization, a small flame of inner strength flickered. This was not just a moment of despair, it was also the first step in reclaiming her life. She would face the cruelty of the world head-on, not as a helpless victim, but as a mother determined to survive, to protect her child, and eventually, to find hope again. In that silence, with only the soft cooing of her newborn for company, she made a silent vow. She would not be defined by abandonment. She would not let the failures of others dictate her path. Though the future seemed uncertain, it belonged entirely to her, and she would navigate it with courage, however difficult the journey might be. The bride stepped hesitantly out of the chapel, her newborn swaddled tightly against her chest, and immediately felt the harsh weight of the town's gaze. The streets, normally bustling with quiet daily life, seemed to pause as if the world itself had stopped to scrutinize her. Mothers clutching children peeked from doorways, merchants at their stalls whispered to one another with pointed glances, and children were hushed by the wary looks of their elders. Every eye seemed to pass judgment, silent yet suffocating, and for the first time, she truly understood how isolating shame could feel when magnified by an entire community. She tried to keep her posture upright, shoulders squared against the invisible pressure of their opinions, but the whispering grew louder as she moved down the street. Left at the altar with that baby, someone muttered under their breath. "What a disgrace," another added, loud enough for her to hear. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, and yet each passing word seemed to strengthen her resolve. She could feel the sting of cruelty, but she refused to crumble entirely. Still, even as she held her child close, fear crept in. Would she find any help at all, or would she be forced to face this public scorn completely alone? The bride found herself at the edge of the town square, a place where celebrations and gossip often collided. Today, the square had transformed into a theater of judgment. Curious onlookers formed small clusters, their conversations halting whenever she passed by, only to resume with renewed volume as she moved further. Every step she took was measured, careful, as though by controlling her own movements, she could somehow control the world's reaction. Yet it felt impossible. The murmurs, the pointed fingers, the casual cruelty of townspeople. It all pressed in like a tide she could not fight against. Despite the judgment, there were moments when the bride caught glimpses of something more complex in the crowd. A few faces softened, showing hesitation or pity. Perhaps they remembered their own vulnerabilities, the times they had been wronged, or maybe they simply recognized the bravery it took to continue standing when all odds seemed against her. These fleeting glances offered a tiny, almost imperceptible comfort, though they were far outnumbered by the scornful majority. She realized that public perception was a fickle thing, shaped more by fear and assumption than truth, and she would need to navigate it carefully. As she searched for a place to sit, a bench beneath a tree provided a small respite. She lowered herself gently, still holding the baby, and allowed herself a few quiet moments of reflection. The child, sensing her tension, whimpered softly, reminding her that she had to maintain composure not just for herself, but for this tiny life that depended entirely on her. The responsibility felt immense, heavier than any dress or wedding plan could ever have symbolized. And yet, there was a strange clarity in the weight of it. While she could not control the whispers of the town, she could control how she responded and how she chose to care for her child amidst the chaos. She realized that the judgment of the town, while painful, could also serve as a catalyst for her inner strength. Every cruel glance and whispered insult reinforced her understanding that she was now the sole architect of her life. She would not allow humiliation to define her worth, nor would she let fear dictate her decisions. Instead, she began to chart a mental path forward, finding shelter, food, and allies, and learning to navigate the treacherous waters of public opinion with courage and determination. By the end of the afternoon, the bride had transformed her despair into quiet resilience. She had faced the harshest judgments and survived them, realizing that her life and that of her child was hers to protect and shape. The town might watch, whisper, and judge, but she had discovered an inner fortitude that could not be dismantled by gossip or cruelty. And as she rose from the bench, adjusting the swaddled infant against her chest, she felt a flicker of hope, that even in a world full of judgment, survival, and perhaps even a brighter future was still possible. As the shadows lengthened across the dusty streets, the bride realized that her trials were only beginning. Alone with her newborn, abandoned and exposed, she faced a daunting reality. Survival would not be simple. Each task, from securing food to finding shelter, became a test of her courage and ingenuity. The town's judgmental eyes lingered, but even more pressing was the immediate need to care for the fragile life in her arms. Her child's small cries punctuated the day, a constant reminder that she could not afford despair. The first challenge was basic sustenance. Markets were closing, and she had no money or family nearby to help. Her gaze scanned the stalls, hoping for a kind merchant, a sympathetic soul willing to part with bread or milk. Some shook their heads, offering only pitying glances. Others whispered to one another, their disapproval unmasked. She felt her stomach tighten with hunger, yet she could not neglect the infant's needs. She had to find nourishment, and quickly, for both herself and the tiny life she carried. With careful determination, she bartered small personal belongings she had brought from home, salvaging enough to buy bread and milk. Every transaction, every whispered exchange was a lesson in resilience. She was learning to survive in a world that offered little mercy. Next came shelter. The chapel offered no refuge. It was not her home and would not protect her from the night's chill. The streets were emptying as the sun sank, and she realized that finding a safe place to rest for her and the baby would be critical. She wandered cautiously, avoiding the areas where townspeople lingered, wary of their judgmental eyes. Finally, she found an abandoned shed at the edge of town, its roof slightly caved, but offering protection from the wind. She moved inside, laying a small blanket for the baby, and huddled nearby, trying to retain warmth. The crude arrangement was far from ideal, yet it represented a step toward survival, a small victory against the harshness of abandonment. Throughout this struggle, her mind raced constantly. She had to plan, anticipate, and adapt. Each decision carried weight. If she left the baby unattended for even a moment, danger could strike. If she revealed weakness in public, cruelty could escalate. Her world had narrowed to a delicate balance of care, vigilance, and resourcefulness. And yet, within these constraints, a fierce determination blossomed. She understood that survival was not only about physical needs, but about protecting her dignity and sense of self in a town eager to define her by failure. Loneliness became another formidable challenge. Without family or friends nearby, she had no one to share the burden, no one to reassure her when fear threatened to overwhelm. Nights were the hardest, when the cries of the baby mingled with the whispering winds, and she questioned whether she could endure another day. But even in solitude, she discovered reservoirs of strength she had not known existed. The baby's tiny fingers clinging to her shirt reminded her of her responsibility, anchoring her determination. She learned to speak softly, to rock gently, to soothe not only the child's physical needs but her own trembling heart. By the end of the first grueling day, she had faced hunger, exhaustion, fear, and judgment and had survived them all. Each small victory, from securing food to finding shelter, became proof of her resilience. She realized that while the world had abandoned her, she had not abandoned herself or her child. In the quiet moments before sleep, she allowed herself a fragile sense of accomplishment. She had endured, and she could continue to endure. The challenges ahead were still vast, but the foundation had been laid. Survival was no longer just a necessity. It had become a statement of strength, a declaration that she would not be defined by betrayal or public scorn. The struggle for survival had hardened her resolve, shaping her into someone capable of facing the harsh realities of the world while still nurturing hope for a better future. And in that small, dusty shed at the edge of town, she held her child close and whispered a silent promise. No matter what came next, she would fight for life, for love, and for the chance to reclaim her destiny. As the bride struggled to navigate her new reality, someone in town was silently taking notice. The rancher, known for his stoic nature and reserved demeanor, had observed the unfolding scene from the outskirts. Few knew much about him. He rarely engaged in gossip, and his presence in the town square was usually fleeting, just enough to acknowledge others politely before returning to his land. Yet, on this day, something about the young bride's plight drew his attention in a way that startled even himself. From a distance, he watched her move through the square, her arms wrapped protectively around her crying infant, her eyes darting nervously at the townspeople whose stares were harsh and unrelenting. There was an undeniable resilience in the way she carried herself, despite the fear and exhaustion that must have been pulling at her every muscle. Something about her determination struck a chord deep within him, a reminder of struggles he had faced quietly in his own life. He remained silent, observing rather than intervening immediately, wanting to understand the full measure of her circumstances before acting. The rancher had long been accustomed to watching life unfold from the sidelines. He knew people often underestimated quiet souls, assuming that silence equaled weakness or disinterest. But he had learned otherwise. He had witnessed countless injustices, personal hardships, and moments of vulnerability that the town ignored or ridiculed. This bride, abandoned on her wedding day with a newborn in her arms, represented the type of quiet suffering that moved him in ways that words could not. He felt a responsibility stir inside him, not one born of duty but of empathy, an instinctive pull toward protecting those who could not protect themselves. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets, he noted how the bride sought refuge at the edge of town, clutching her child as if the world might snatch her away at any moment. Her cautious movements, the way she paused to assess her surroundings before each step, revealed both fear and intelligence. She was learning, adapting, and surviving despite the harsh judgment around her. And yet, even from a distance, the rancher recognized the isolation she faced. No friend or family accompanied her, and the townspeople's whispers seemed to pierce through the quiet like a sharp wind. His mind wandered briefly to his own life, recalling times when he had remained silent while others suffered, unsure of whether to step in or respect their independence. Now, watching her, he realized that the moment for observation was giving way to the need for action. He could no longer simply be a passive witness to her struggle. Not yet. But he would approach carefully, gently. His presence alone would need to offer reassurance, not overwhelm. He took a slow step closer, his boots crunching softly on the gravel road, and kept his distance, watching how she interacted with her baby. The child, sensing her mother's tension, fussed and shifted, and she responded with calm persistence, rocking, humming, and speaking softly to soothe the tiny being. The rancher admired her composure, her strength under pressure, and the quiet authority with which she managed her fragile world. Here was someone who, despite fear and betrayal, had not given up. As twilight approached, he made a decision. Tomorrow he would offer help, not with words of pity, but with tangible support, food, advice, shelter if necessary. His quiet observation had revealed more than just the bride's immediate struggles. It had revealed her character, and in that recognition he saw an opportunity, not to rescue, but to stand alongside her, providing assistance while respecting her autonomy. That evening, as the bride settled in a small hidden nook at the edge of town, the rancher retreated silently, his thoughts fixed on the future. He knew he would not intrude recklessly, but he could not ignore the plight of someone so clearly determined to survive. In his quiet way, he felt a connection forming, a thread that might one day grow into trust, and perhaps into something deeper. Watching from afar, he understood that sometimes the first step in changing a life was simply to notice, truly see, and prepare to act when the time was right. The following morning, the bride awoke to the faint glow of dawn spilling over the edge of her makeshift shelter. The baby stirred in her arms, tiny fingers curling around her clothing, and she felt the familiar ache of exhaustion from a night spent trying to soothe a restless child. Hunger gnawed at her, but she could not dwell on her own needs, not yet. Every moment required vigilance, every action measured. And yet she sensed something different in the quiet of the early morning, a presence, patient and calm, watching without judgment. From across the street, the rancher observed her carefully, making certain that his approach would not startle or intimidate. He had spent the previous evening planning how he could assist without overstepping, without making her feel like she was being patronized or pitied. He understood from experience that the most meaningful help was often subtle, almost invisible in its generosity. Today, he would take the first step, not as a rescuer, but as someone willing to share the burden of her struggle. The bride, unaware of his intentions, began to tidy her small corner of the street, adjusting the blanket around her baby and organizing the few belongings she had. Her movements were deliberate but weary, every gesture betraying her exhaustion. The rancher approached slowly, clearing his throat lightly, careful not to startle her. "Morning," he said in a low, steady voice. There was no judgment in it, no condescension, only the quiet tone of a man accustomed to speaking only when necessary. The bride froze, clutching her child instinctively. Uncertainty and wariness etched into her features. "I thought you might need this," he continued, extending a small basket filled with bread, cheese, and a flask of milk. The gesture was simple, almost ordinary, but to the bride it was a lifeline. She hesitated, scanning his face for any hidden intent, then finally accepted it, her fingers brushing his as she took the basket. It was such a small act, yet in that moment, it carried profound significance. Someone had noticed her struggle, recognized her resilience, and offered support without expectation, without judgment. As she unpacked the food, the baby settled against her chest, lulled by the calm presence of another adult. The bride felt a rush of gratitude mixed with relief. For the first time since the wedding, she sensed that she was not entirely alone, that someone had seen her pain and chosen to respond with empathy. This small act of kindness was more than nourishment for her body. It was nourishment for her spirit. It reminded her that even in the harshest circumstances, the world could still hold quiet generosity. The rancher remained nearby, neither intrusive nor distant, simply allowing her the space to accept his help on her own terms. He observed her carefully as she fed the baby, noting the tender way she rocked and whispered soft words. Her determination to protect and care for her child, even amid chaos, impressed him deeply. He realized that his role was not to lead or instruct, but to offer a steady, reliable presence that might allow her to regain her footing. Over the next few hours, small gestures continued. A refill of water, a gentle suggestion for a safer corner to rest, a quiet reminder that she could ask for assistance if needed. The bride began to relax, sensing that this man's intentions were genuine. She still carried caution and wariness, the scars of betrayal evident in her eyes. But for the first time, she felt the faint spark of trust. It was fragile, delicate, but real. A seed that might grow into something stronger as days passed. By the time the sun had fully risen, the bride had eaten, rested briefly, and gained a renewed sense of hope. The rancher's small act of kindness had accomplished more than he could have imagined. It had reminded her that she was not invisible, that even in the midst of abandonment and judgment, support could appear in the most unexpected forms. She realized that survival might no longer be a solitary struggle. With careful, measured help, perhaps she could navigate this new life with her child without facing it entirely alone. In that moment, the smallest gesture, a simple basket of food, changed everything. It marked the first step in a tentative alliance, a cautious bridge between two very different lives, and set the stage for a relationship built not on obligation, but on trust, respect, and mutual recognition of strength. In the days that followed, the bride began to notice the rancher's quiet presence more clearly. He didn't crowd her or speak unnecessarily. Instead, he observed from a respectful distance, intervening only when she truly needed assistance. There was no rush, no expectation of repayment, only a steady consistency that slowly began to break through the walls she had built around herself. For someone who had been abandoned and ridiculed, this subtle constancy was revolutionary. It was the first time in weeks that she began to sense the possibility of a safe, reliable connection. At first, interactions were tentative. The bride would accept small acts of help, refilling her water, offering food, suggesting safer places for her and the baby to rest, but she rarely spoke more than necessary. She was guarded, each word measured because trust had been shattered before. The rancher understood this. He had learned that trust could not be forced. It could only be earned through patience, understanding, and the consistent demonstration of integrity. And so he allowed her space, silently communicating that he would be there, but never intruding where he was not wanted. Gradually, small conversations began to emerge. One morning, as the baby fussed after feeding, the rancher spoke in his calm, even voice. "She's beautiful, your little one. Strong, too." There was no flattery, no condescension, just an observation. The bride's eyes softened slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing. For the first time, she realized that he saw her not as a spectacle of misfortune, but as a capable mother who was doing her best under impossible circumstances. That recognition, quiet and unobtrusive, was more powerful than words of pity could ever have been. Over time, the bride began to share fragments of her story. First, she spoke of the wedding day. The empty chapel, the harsh whispers, the crushing disappointment of betrayal. She spoke carefully as though testing whether he could be trusted with such vulnerability. The rancher listened without interruption, his attention unwavering, his demeanor steady. He offered no judgment, no unsolicited advice, simply acknowledgement, a rare gift for someone who had been defined by loss and ridicule for so long. Their bond deepened as he offered guidance on practical matters. He suggested ways to make her shelter safer, gave tips for feeding and soothing the baby, and occasionally helped with errands into town. Yet everything was done gently, never imposing, never assuming superiority. With each act, trust grew, not instantly, but gradually, like water seeping into dry soil. The bride began to realize that someone could care for her and her child without seeking control or reward. That realization was both liberating and humbling, shaking the foundations of the fear she had carried since her abandonment. The rancher, too, began to reveal small parts of himself, not through words of grand confession, but in quiet habits that reflected his reliability, a careful hand with the baby, the way he repaired her shelter with steady, skillful movements, or the way he would pause to ensure she was comfortable before speaking. These small glimpses offered reassurance, showing that he could be depended upon. And in return, the bride felt her own walls soften, her caution giving way to cautious hope. By the end of the week, the change in their dynamic was palpable. What had begun as wary observation and small acts of assistance had evolved into mutual respect and quiet companionship. The bride no longer felt entirely alone. She could acknowledge her own vulnerability without fear of ridicule. And the rancher had discovered a rare, unspoken connection, one that required no grand gestures, only patience, understanding, and the willingness to stand beside someone as they navigated hardship. Trust, they both learned, was built not in moments of grandeur, but in the quiet constancy of presence. And as the sun set over the edge of the town, casting long shadows across their small corner of the world, the bride felt, perhaps for the first time in weeks, that she could breathe. She was no longer entirely alone, and that simple, profound realization marked a turning point, the beginning of a fragile but growing bond, one that might just transform her life and the life of her child forever. As the days passed, the bride grew stronger, not just in her ability to care for her child, but in her growing confidence and sense of self. She had learned to navigate the harsh judgment of the townspeople, finding resilience in the quiet support of the rancher and the small victories she accomplished each day. Yet despite her progress, the town continued to whisper, to point, to cast judgment that was harsh and unforgiving. Every glance from a window or muttered comment on the street was a reminder of her abandonment, a lingering scar from the wedding day. She realized that surviving in silence was no longer enough. She needed to assert herself, to reclaim dignity not just for herself, but for the future she was building with her child. The first confrontation came unexpectedly. She had ventured to the market, a place she once avoided out of fear of ridicule. As she passed the stalls, a group of townspeople began to snicker, loud enough for her to hear. "Still here with that child?" one whispered. "I told you no man will want her now." The words stung, like icy needles against her skin. For a moment, the bride's hands tightened around the basket she carried, and her breath caught. The baby stirred, sensing tension, and she realized she had a choice: retreat in fear as she had done for weeks, or stand her ground. With a steadying breath, she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and met the eyes of those who sneered. "My child and I are doing just fine," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We have enough food, a place to stay, and the strength to live our lives. Your opinions do not define us." Her words, though simple, carried the weight of newfound courage. She spoke not out of anger, but out of self-respect, a refusal to allow the town's cruelty to shape her worth. The rancher, watching from the edge of the crowd, remained quietly supportive. He didn't intervene with words, but his presence alone was a shield. The townspeople, recognizing his silent authority and reputation, faltered. His steady gaze conveyed a message that words could not, that she was not alone, that there was someone willing to stand by her, and that their judgment carried no power over her when she chose to claim her own strength. Emboldened by his support, the bride continued. She addressed not just the small group who had mocked her, but the murmurs and stares of the wider crowd. "We all have struggles," she said, her voice carrying across the square. "Some are visible, some are not. I have been abandoned, yes, but that does not make me weak. It makes me responsible for my own life and my child's future. And that I will honor every single day." The town fell silent. Her words resonated with a clarity that cut through judgment, leaving no room for the mockery that had once seemed so overwhelming. Over the next few days, a shift began to occur. Some townspeople, previously cruel in their whispers, began to regard her with respect, or at least restraint. They noticed her determination, her tireless care for her child, and the quiet strength she radiated. The bride realized that standing up to the town was not about confrontation for its own sake, but about asserting her right to exist with dignity. She didn't need to punish their judgment. She simply needed to show that it had no power over her. Through this experience, the bond with the rancher deepened further. He saw her courage not as a spectacle, but as an authentic expression of her character. And she, in turn, understood that true support often came not in the form of grand gestures, but in the quiet presence of someone who believed in her, silently amplifying her own voice. By reclaiming her dignity, the bride had transformed the town's perception. But more importantly, she had transformed herself. She had learned that strength was not only about survival, but about asserting one's worth in the face of scorn. Standing up to the town marked a pivotal turning point. The realization that she was capable of shaping her life, protecting her child and claiming her place in the world, regardless of the cruelty or judgment surrounding her. In the days and weeks following the bride's quiet but firm assertion of herself to the town, a subtle yet profound change began to take place, not only in her life but in her relationship with the rancher. The initial distance between them, shaped by caution, observation, and mutual respect, began to shrink. What started as careful acts of assistance evolved into companionship, a connection grounded in trust, understanding, and the recognition of each other's resilience. At first, the connection manifested in small, almost imperceptible ways. The rancher would check in on her and the baby, ensuring their needs were met, but without imposing himself. He helped carry firewood, offered advice on better ways to protect the child from the harsh winds, and quietly repaired sections of her shelter that had begun to wear. These acts, repeated day after day, spoke louder than any words could. To the bride, they were proof that he respected her independence while acknowledging her vulnerability. In his presence, she felt a rare sense of security, a quiet confidence that allowed her to breathe more easily. Their conversations, once minimal and cautious, began to deepen. In the early mornings or late evenings, when the world was still and the baby slept, they would talk not about grand matters, but about ordinary life, the changing seasons, the best spots for finding fresh water, small memories from childhood. Slowly, the bride began to share her fears, hopes, and dreams. She spoke of the heartbreak from her abandoned wedding, the weight of responsibility she carried for her child, and the fleeting moments of doubt that haunted her. The rancher listened with unwavering attention, never rushing her or offering empty reassurances. His presence alone, steady, calm, and patient, became a source of comfort. In turn, the rancher allowed glimpses into his own life, though carefully measured. She learned of the years he had spent working the land, the quiet solitude he preferred, and the challenges he had faced alone. There were no dramatic confessions, only the subtle unveiling of a man who understood hardship, loss, and perseverance. These shared fragments of life, exchanged in mutual respect, formed the foundation of a bond that was both tender and unshakable. They recognized in each other a quiet strength that did not need grand gestures to be validated. As the days went on, their connection extended to shared care for the baby. The rancher, once a distant observer, now helped in small, deliberate ways, holding the child while the bride rested, preparing simple meals, or assisting with bathing and dressing. These moments created a rhythm between them, a natural partnership built on trust, reliability, and mutual regard. The bride's initial wariness softened into a genuine sense of companionship, while the rancher found himself quietly drawn to her resilience, courage, and unwavering love for her child. What made their connection profound was its balance. Neither sought to dominate the other, nor did either expect immediate intimacy or emotional surrender. Instead, the bond developed organically, shaped by consistent acts of kindness, empathy, and shared responsibility. The bride began to feel that she could lean on someone without losing her autonomy, and the rancher discovered that connection did not have to come with compromise. It could grow in respect, patience, and silent acknowledgement of each other's strengths. By the end of the first month, the relationship had evolved beyond necessity or convenience. It was no longer about survival alone. It was about trust, understanding, and a shared hope for the future. The bride, once isolated and abandoned, felt her world expand gently but irrevocably, and the rancher, once a quiet observer at the edge of the town, had found a meaningful place in her life, one that allowed him to share not just help, but genuine companionship. In the quiet of the evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold, the bride and rancher would sit together, baby nestled safely between them. They no longer needed words to define the connection they shared. It was evident in their shared glances, subtle gestures, and the unspoken understanding that they had found in each other a safe harbor. This growing connection marked the beginning of something deeper than friendship, an emotional foundation that promised hope, love, and a future neither of them could have anticipated when their paths first crossed. The bride had come a long way since the day she was left standing at the altar with a newborn in her arms. Yet, even as her days grew brighter and her heart lighter, fear still lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. It was not the loud, consuming terror of the past, but a quiet, persistent doubt, one that whispered in moments of stillness, reminding her of all she had lost and all she could lose again. Her life with the rancher had begun to take on a comforting rhythm. They shared chores, laughter, and quiet dinners by the fire. The baby, now smiling and reaching for everything, filled the house with a warmth that made the days seem shorter and the nights more peaceful. Yet beneath that peace, she found herself questioning her own worth. Could she really deserve this happiness? Was she strong enough to accept love again, after being betrayed so deeply? One evening, while the rancher repaired the fence outside, she sat by the window watching the horizon glow in shades of orange and gold. The baby cooed softly in her arms, his little fingers curling around her own. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to think of the man who had abandoned her, the one who had left her in shame and despair. Instead of bitterness, she felt something different. Release. The pain that had once defined her was now a memory, no longer a wound that bled with every thought. She realized she had survived what once seemed impossible, and that survival had made her strong. Later that night, she joined the rancher by the fire. He noticed her quiet mood and asked gently, "You've been far away tonight." She hesitated before answering. "I keep wondering when it will all fall apart," she admitted. "I've learned to live without expecting kindness. Every time it comes, I think it must be borrowed, not earned." The rancher looked at her for a long moment before replying, his voice calm and sincere. "Kindness isn't borrowed, not real kindness. It's given. You don't have to earn it, and you don't have to fear losing it. You've been through enough storms to know that some people don't leave. Some stay." His words were simple, but they sank deep into her heart. She realized then that her fear of happiness was just another form of the pain she had already conquered. To overcome it, she needed to trust, not blindly but bravely. Trust that life could offer second chances. Trust that she could be loved without being left behind. In the days that followed, she began to live with that quiet trust. She stopped holding herself back in small ways, the hesitant smile, the half-step away when he reached for her hand, the guarded silence when he spoke of the future. Instead, she began to respond freely. When he laughed, she laughed too. When he shared his plans for the ranch, she listened with hope, not fear. And when he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, she didn't flinch, she leaned in. Slowly, her world shifted from survival to living, from mere endurance to belonging. The fear that had once ruled her began to dissolve, replaced by a steady flame of hope. She realized that love was not a promise of perfection or safety. It was a willingness to face uncertainty together, with courage and faith. One morning, as she watched the rancher feeding the horses, sunlight pouring over the land like a blessing, she felt peace settle deep within her. For the first time, she wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. She was simply grateful for the home they were building, for the laughter that filled their days, and for the quiet strength that had carried her from despair to hope. The bride had finally learned that healing was not about forgetting the past. It was about no longer fearing it. And in learning that, she found the courage to embrace the love that stood right before her, patient and steadfast, waiting for her to believe in it fully. The morning of the new beginning arrived not with fanfare or grand gestures, but with the quiet peace of a sunrise spreading over the ranch. The golden light touched every blade of grass, every fence post, every corner of the home the bride had helped to rebuild, not just with her hands, but with her heart. The baby, now older and full of laughter, crawled near the doorway, his giggles filling the air. The bride stood at the window holding a steaming cup of tea, watching the rancher saddle his horse. It was an ordinary moment, yet it carried within it the extraordinary weight of everything they had survived. There had been no formal proposal, no promises etched in rings or ceremony, but something deeper had been forged between them. A quiet, steadfast love built from respect, trust, and shared endurance. The townspeople who once whispered now nodded politely when they passed, and some even smiled. Time had softened their judgment, but it was not the town's acceptance that mattered anymore. What mattered was that she had learned to accept herself. That morning, the rancher returned from the stables, brushing the dust from his hat. He paused by the door, watching her with a small smile. "You've made this place feel different," he said softly. "Alive." She looked up at him, her heart full. "We both did," she replied. "It wasn't alive until you helped me believe it could be." They shared a quiet moment, the kind that said more than words ever could. The baby reached toward him, and the rancher lifted the child easily, resting him on his arm. The boy's laughter echoed between them, a sound that seemed to bless the home they had built together. Later that day, they rode out to the far edge of the property. The bride, though still learning to ride, sat confidently on her horse beside him. The land stretched wide before them, endless and golden beneath the late spring sun. "This," he said, looking out across the horizon, "is where we start again." She followed his gaze, her eyes filling with tears, not of sadness, but of gratitude. "I used to think my life ended that day," she whispered, remembering the altar, the shame, the loneliness. But it was only beginning. The rancher turned toward her, his expression gentle but sure. Sometimes life has to break before it can build something real. They rode for hours, talking and laughing, making plans for the future, plans that felt natural, not forced. She spoke of wanting to plant a small garden near the porch, of teaching the baby to walk on soft grass instead of dirt, of opening her home to others who might need shelter, just as she had once needed it. The rancher listened with quiet admiration, offering his strength to her vision without ever overshadowing it. When they returned to the house, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber. She stood on the porch, holding the baby close, feeling the warmth of the day linger on her skin. The rancher joined her, their shoulders brushing lightly. "You know," he said, his voice low, "this house doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels like a family." She turned toward him, smiling through tears. "Because it is," she said simply. In that moment, she realized how far she had come, from the broken bride abandoned with a newborn to the woman who now stood with hope in her heart and love by her side. The fear, the shame, the loneliness, all of it had led her here, to a life not perfect but real, not easy but hers. As the first stars appeared, she felt peace settle over her like a blessing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, hard work, long days, and sleepless nights, but she no longer feared what was ahead. For the first time, she was not standing alone. The bride looked at the rancher, at the child between them, and at the vast sky above. "We're home," she whispered, and in that simple truth, spoken softly into the twilight, her story found its new beginning.